Good morning, everyone. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Asia House Global Trade Dialogue for 2019. I'm Michael Lawrence, Chief Executive of Asia House, and we're delighted to be back in Singapore. We staged the dialogue here 12 months ago. Much has happened in that time. Trade remains central to the geopolitical and macroeconomic debate. It's driving change in economies, in government policy and businesses. And with the world facing an economic slowdown, some warning that it may perhaps drop into recession, the trade debate has become even more important. The tensions between the US and China on trade have dominated international headlines for years. And while the breakthrough in the long-running trade talks appears to be in sight, that is the Phase 1 deal, it's unlikely to tackle a number of the issues at the very core of the dispute, including intellectual property and forced technology transfer. The US-China trade conflict has inflicted the most damage on the global economy, but it's not the only factor at play. The negotiations around RCEP, which promises to be the world's biggest trading deal, hit a hurdle just this week, with India withdrawing from the pact. It will go ahead, but without India. Two of Asia's biggest economies, Japan and South Korea, have been locked in a trade conflict. In calmer times, that dispute alone would be top of the agenda for discussion. There's the turmoil in Hong Kong, which has put Hong Kong's place as a global trading and financial hub under intense international scrutiny. Brexit, the UK's decision to leave the European Union. The UK is now due to have an election in December, with the country deeply divided after 3 years of fierce and at times toxic debate. And there's the demand, some would say the absolute need, for reform of the WTO. As these geopolitical issues play out, technology and the burgeoning digital economy, particularly in ASEAN, promises even greater disruption. Data and who owns it and controls it may well be another front in future trade wars. A new breed of trade deal may be needed, one which embraces the digital ecosystem and is designed to encourage and support digital trade. And what role can ASEAN play in the midst of these dramatic shifts in global trading architecture? Singapore's Prime Minister Lee only this week called on ASEAN members to intensify integration efforts and uphold a free, open and rules-based multilateral trading system. The global backdrop, the Prime Minister said, has made it more urgent than ever that ASEAN come together to deepen cooperation in order to counter the unfavourable external forces. The Prime Minister has also called on the multilateral trading system to be updated to reflect the realities of the digital economy and continue to function in a politically sustainable way. These are just some of the issues we will explore this morning in this latest edition of the Asia House Global Trade Dialogue, for which we have assembled an impressive list of experts and decision makers who will share their thoughts and their insights with you. In a moment, I will invite our keynote speaker, Mr. Iswaran, the Minister for Communications and Information, and Minister in charge of Trade Relations, to deliver our opening address. Minister, welcome. Great to have you here. The Minister has then kindly agreed to take some questions from me, and he'll take some from the floor as well, so be prepared. That will be followed by our first panel, which will delve more deeply into the major geopolitical issues driving world trade. I'll then be joined on stage for a question and answer session with our special guest, Stuart Gulliver, who until February of last year, was the Chief Executive of HSBC after a very distinguished career in banking. He now serves on a number of boards, including Jardines and the Asia House Advisory Board. After the break, we'll take a deep dive into disruptive tech. David Hardoon of MAS will open the session. He was going to give a presentation, but after an animated conversation last night, he's agreed to go off-piste and speak off the cuff. And he'll be joined then on a panel for discussion, two of the disruptors, Revolut and Ripple. A look at Asia's digital economy will follow with Google, Bukalapak, Accenture, Pfizer, and Tiger Investments. That's investor in tech. Future Cities is also on the agenda today, with a focus on sustainability and the use of big data and AI to develop solutions. And we'll wrap up our dialogue with a dialogue between our chairman, Lord Stephen Green, and Arantxa Gonzalez, US Undersecretary General and Executive Director of the International Trade Center. So it really is a packed program. We want you involved throughout. There'll be questions from the audience in each of the sessions. We invite you to participate. Your comments and questions are very welcome. But to get us underway and to deliver the keynote address, please welcome to the podium Minister Iswaran.
Lord Stephen Green, the Chairman of Asia House, Mr. Michael Lawrence, the Chief Executive of Asia House, see many ambassadors and high commissioners, excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to all of you. Let me begin by thanking Asia House for the kind invitation to speak at this dialogue today. This is the second run of the Asia House Global Trade Dialogue in Singapore. And I believe that dialogues like these make an important contribution to the global discourse on the evolving trade architecture and the need for us to keep abreast of compelling economic trends. This is a vast topic, and I've chosen to keep my comments confined to one or two specific areas so that then we can explore them further and other areas of interest in the Q&A later. But let me start by observing that global trade has been the foundation of economic growth and development. If we consider developments from historical times, and even in the recent post-World War II Bretton Woods era, it is really trade and the institutions that have facilitated it that has helped to catalyze the exchange of ideas, create new economic opportunities, and above all, lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. Singapore's own history is testament to this. 200 years ago, the British made Singapore a free port, and that enabled a small fishing port to thrive as an open economy and global city. And because we understand its value and potential from experience, Singapore is a keen advocate for trade liberalization and a rules-based multilateral trading system. The dialogue on global trade assumes even greater relevance in this digital era, with the advent of technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, and the use of big data. In Southeast Asia alone, the digital economy is expected to treble in size to $300 billion by the year 2025, and some think that might be a conservative estimate. But this digital transition, whilst creating opportunities, will also disrupt jobs, business models, industries, and economies. McKinsey estimates that by 2030, some 14% of the global workforce, about 375 million workers, may have to find new occupations. These concerns are exacerbated by current economic uncertainty due to trade tensions between the US and China, the preoccupation with Brexit in Europe, the rise of populist sentiments against globalization. And these challenges stem from the very real problems faced by local populations and industries in adapting to these forces of globalization and technological change. But our response cannot be to retreat to protectionism, restrictions on trade, or beggar thy neighbor policies. As proven time and again, such policies ultimately result in a poorer outcome for all. So what then should underpin our trade and economic strategy in this era of digital transformation? Globalization and technological change can create much value and opportunities, yet cause profound dislocations for workers and businesses. And unless there is a fair distribution of the larger benefits, the natural instinct is to push back against the greater competition and disruptive change wrought by these two megatrends. Our efforts to embrace technology and economic integration must therefore be matched by an equitable distribution of the benefits and the access to opportunities. In other words, our response to today's economic challenges must be anchored by two key thrusts: staying open so that we continue to be able to seize opportunities and grow the pie, and being inclusive so that we are able to ensure those opportunities and the access to them are equitably distributed. Let me elaborate further from Singapore's perspective. First, staying open, which means a willingness to engage with the world, embrace novel ideas, venture into emerging markets, and seize new opportunities while accepting the associated risks. Sustaining such a mindset is challenging in normal times, but especially so in times of economic uncertainty, when you have to stand on principle, conviction, and go against the grain and popular sentiments, and that requires political will and strong leadership. Let me cite some examples from Singapore's experience where we have endeavored to do the fundamentally right thing, even if it goes against the grain. At our independence in 1965, separation from Malaysia meant the loss of a common market and hinterland. And a few years later, the withdrawal of British troops also led to job losses. And the government of the day made two key decisions. The first was to shift away from import substitution to export-led industrialization. And the second was to attract global multinational corporations. Neither was the conventional wisdom of the times. Yet these two critical decisions of our founding leaders, for which they vigorously canvassed and secured the support of our citizens, gave Singapore a competitive edge that has enabled us to emerge as a newly industrialized economy. Similarly, 20 years ago, we embarked on an external economic strategy that focused on forging bilateral trade agreements. We saw our bilateral FTAs as a further expression of our commitment towards an open, connected, and globalized world. Yet, at that time, our bilateral FTA strategy was not orthodox thinking, and critics argued that such FTAs could damage free trade and the multilateral trading system. In contrast, today, they are accepted and seen as a constructive component of the global trade architecture. And our network of over 24 free trade agreements with 36 trading partners yields significant benefits for our businesses and our people. We now need a similar open approach and a willingness to embrace the challenge and reap the benefits of the digital economy. For instance, data is a critical resource for the digital economy. The volume of cross-border data flows in 2017 was nearly 150 times that in 2005. Yet, trade agreements that were conceived in a pre-digital era are not designed for these new economic realities and trade patterns. It is therefore in our collective interests to update global trade agreements or strike new arrangements to facilitate the flow of data and digital transactions. And that is why we have embarked on negotiations for digital economy agreements. These DEAs aim to establish clear and harmonized international rules that promote greater interoperability between digital frameworks and allow data to flow freely between countries with appropriate safeguards. For a start, we are working with like-minded countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Chile. We have also worked on similar initiatives at the regional and multilateral levels through the ASEAN Cross-Border Data Flows Mechanism, the APEC CBPR, and the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce at the WTO. We complement these new digital agreement initiatives with a continuing emphasis on building on existing free trade agreements and forging new ones. In particular, we are working to conclude the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement and also the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And collectively, these, both the enhancement and development of existing free trade agreements and the initiatives on the new digital economy, are both going to be important in undergirding global trade and the prospects for growth. Staying open to new ideas and innovative modes of engagement with the world has been key to Singapore's progress, and I believe indeed that of many countries around the world. And we are therefore committed to working with like-minded partners to support the growth of the digital economy that in turn can yield significant benefits for the overall economy. However, for this strategy to be sustainable, it is essential that the macro gains from trade and globalization also translate into opportunities and benefits at the micro level for individual workers and small businesses. In other words, our external strategy through trade and economic integration must be complemented by domestic strategy that allows the local constituencies, those stakeholders who are affected by these changes, to be able to respond to them and benefit from them. So this brings me to the second thrust, being inclusive. Ultimately, the goal and measure of success of our economic strategy rests on how well it creates jobs for our people and opportunities for our businesses. So it's imperative that governments seek to mitigate the risk of dislocation posed by globalization and technological advances by helping businesses and individuals adapt and participate in the new opportunities that are being created. In other words, it's not just adopting a laissez-faire approach, but taking a purposeful strategy that is focused on this aspect. In particular, we must focus on the segments of our economy who may disproportionately bear the burden of adjustment, such as small and medium enterprises and less skilled workers. For enterprises, our aim must be to help deepen their capabilities and innovation capacity, because that would give them the wherewithal with which to deal with some of these emerging challenges. In Singapore, we do so through various initiatives, such as what we call the SME Go Digital program, which assists small businesses to adopt new technologies by pre-qualifying tech solutions and helping to defray part of the costs. We aid their innovation activities by granting favorable IP licensing terms and seconding scientists and researchers from our research institutes to work with these companies on their innovation blueprints. We also help our SMEs venture abroad by harnessing the benefits of our free trade agreements. In partnership with trade associations and chambers, we inform our businesses of the benefits they can derive from our free trade agreements through regular education and outreach activities, training courses, and business missions. One of our economic agencies, Enterprise Singapore, has also developed a tariff search engine that companies can use to ascertain the preferential margins for specific products in each market, along with rules of origin criteria and documentation. In other words, helping especially small enterprises unpack what might otherwise seem to be complex trade agreements, and for them to understand how it is relevant to their business and help them utilize those agreements to their benefit. For workers, it is our national priority to nurture a culture of lifelong learning and skills upgrading. So, Skills Future, as we call it, is a broad-based national program that embodies this goal by giving individuals the resources and the guidance to take charge of their own learning. This is a broad program to imbue this culture of lifelong learning and skills acquisition in all our citizens. More specifically, we have developed skills and training roadmaps for 23 industry verticals and subsectors, which collectively account for about 80 to 85% of our GDP, in partnership with industry and unions. The aim of these roadmaps is to guide both employees and workers in the sectors, but also the employers and companies in the sectors to understand the skills that are needed at every step of the worker's journey in order to attain higher skills level and contribute a higher value add. These are complemented by subsidized training programs that help workers, on the one hand, acquire higher skills within their own sectors, or to acquire new skills needed in other sectors where jobs are being created. In Singapore, for example, jobs are being created in the Infocom media sector, in healthcare and allied sectors, and also in education and preschool. So we need to be able to bridge people into these sectors, especially for those who may not have the requisite skills for them. So it's evident from this brief account that I've outlined, being inclusive cannot just be a broad statement of objective or strategy. That national level commitment is important, but it is not sufficient. To be truly effective, it must be detailed and taken down to the level of individual industries, companies, and individuals, so as to address specific needs and challenges. And that is why this effort of any government depends critically on its partnership with workers and employers, with workers taking ownership for their learning and skills development, and employers navigating their organization's digital transformation while supporting their workers' skills transition. And it is only through such a comprehensive and collaborative strategy that we can strive towards a truly inclusive economic outcome. So, whilst the dialogue today is about trade on its own, without an effective complementary domestic strategy, will, I think, not achieve the desired outcomes and indeed run into the headwinds of populist sentiments. So to recap, technological advances and the digital economy present significant new opportunities, but they also pose profound disruptive threats to businesses, jobs, and industries. And to fully realize the benefits and seize the opportunities, we need to stay open to new ideas and technologies and new modes of engagement with emerging markets. To mitigate the risks of dislocation and to ensure an equitable distribution of outcomes and access to them, we must be inclusive in our approach. And that means governments taking a detailed and comprehensive approach and collaborating with unions and industry to build worker skills and enterprises' capabilities. Staying open and being inclusive has underpinned the Singapore story and our journey thus far. And I believe these values will endure as our cardinal points as we work with our partners from around the world to navigate the path towards a digital future that is rich with opportunities and possibilities for all our people. Thank you for inviting me.
Mister, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thank you for delivering our keynote address. I want to start with the big picture, the US-China conflict, trade conflict. A phase one deal seems to be almost done. Is this the beginning of the end of the conflict, or is this a blip, an upward blip in what's going to be a long-running issue?
I think it's hard to speculate on how this is going to unfold. But what I am prepared to comment on is the significance of, as you've described it, a phase one outcome. I think the largest issue that weighs heavily on all our deliberations is the risk of bifurcation in the world and a disengagement between the US and China. That is not in the interest of either country or the global economy. So I think the significance of a possible deal, even if it is limited in scope, is that it demonstrates a willingness to engage and a commitment to find solutions. It may not address all the issues, but it does indicate a willingness to start. And I think we should therefore, and I belong to the group that looks at it as a glass half full, that we should think of it in terms of a positive step forward. It doesn't mean all the issues have been resolved or can be resolved in this, in quick time. But there's a sense that neither party wants to end up with an outcome that is adverse to their own economies. And this, I think, is manifested in the way this deal is being constructed. So I would watch the space very closely, but also draw some hope from the way it has evolved in recent times.
How concerned are you that Singapore may have to choose a side? The divisions between the US and China are such that there are some companies and some countries who are under pressure to say, we're following your path, not the other.
I think that is a false choice in many ways. And why I say that is because I think for most countries, their engagement with the US and with China are both substantial. And nobody really wants to be in a position where they're forced to choose or being asked to choose. So if I, for example, talk about Singapore, the US is our largest cumulative investor. And China is our single largest country-level trading partner. And we are also a major investor in China. In fact, I think it is the largest investment destination for Singapore. So when you look at this, it's really not about making a choice, and we don't want to get in that position. I think if you look at also the level of economic integration between China and the US, again, given the level of integration, it is not desirable for either country to decouple. So I would say that if we allow for a rational process which assesses the costs and the benefits, and there may be issues that need to be resolved, I think overall the right outcome would be one where there's engagement and an attempt to resolve differences and allow all countries to be a part of that solution.
I want to turn to RCEP now, and India withdrew this week. Is that a blow or a blessing?
You betray your journalistic background. Well, RCEP has been an important effort. You know, it's 10 ASEAN plus 6. And clearly, India being a part of it has been an important part of our efforts, because India is a significant economy, an economy that offers much potential, and I think with its integration into this larger regional economic partnership, we think the whole will be much greater than the sum of the parts. But having said that, I think we respect the fact that India, for a variety of reasons and considerations, has opted not to participate at this juncture. Is it a disappointment? Yes. But is it something that has to be a permanent outcome? No. I think and I think the other 15 RCEP countries would be considering is how to keep the door open for India to come in at the appropriate time, but without compromising the disciplines and the protocols that we've all agreed to. I think it's important that we keep the engagement and in order to realize the full potential, because India is going to be not just a big market, but also an important part of the supply chains in the region. And so its integration into RCEP is key.
But had India not withdrawn, the prospect of years more negotiation was on the table, wasn't it?
Not necessarily. From what I understand, I've not been involved in the negotiations directly, but I think the chapters had all been agreed to. I think it was really a question of India, whether they were comfortable with those outcomes that had been negotiated.
Okay. I want to turn now to data, and you talked about it in your speech, and data flows in particular. There's a rise in what's being termed data nationalism. So policy decisions to stop data crossing borders. That's a serious threat to the digital aspirations of Singapore, of ASEAN, and many other players.
Yes, I think data is basically what undergirds the digital economy, and we need to avoid the lexicon that equates data with oil, for a start. And I have tried to persuade people that don't think of data as the new oil. Why do I say that? Because oil is a perishable resource, and once you've consumed it, it is gone. Data, on the other hand, is enhanced in its value when you aggregate it, when you connect it, when you organize it, and you find relationships. So that being the case, no matter how large the data set we have as individual countries, it is in the connectivity of that data and the enhanced evaluation that derives from it that really makes a difference. So the risk of data localization is real, but it is born in some instances of a perception or wrong perception of data and the risks of cross-border flows. In the conversations I've had with tech companies, for example, I've emphasized to them, governments do have legitimate concerns around security, around confidentiality, and particularly about certain types of data. The question is how the private sector presents not just its asks, but also how it can be a part of the solution. What sort of arrangements and structures can be made? Governments can strike deals, but at the end of the day, there must be arrangements that work for the private sector. And the private sector, in turn, has to be able to give us some clear ideas as to how this can be made possible. So we've been working, as I've described earlier, within ASEAN on how we can facilitate cross-border flows. I think there have been some interesting new developments in Indonesia in this regard, with a greater openness to the idea of data flow across borders. And I think in particular, a lot of this is driven by the fact that in our region alone, for example, there are more and more companies that are transnational in nature, that are driving growth in the digital economy by using data that is drawn from different jurisdictions. In Singapore, for example, we've got Gojek, which is an Indonesian company in the ride-hailing business. You've got companies like Traveloka from Indonesia, and and we've got a whole bunch of other unicorns and so on who are involved in these kinds of business. And so I think there's a realization and appreciation that data flow can be beneficial. It's a question not of stopping it, but about how we can manage it.
You need a policy and a harmonised policy around
right.
it. Minister, you're willing to take questions from the audience, so we have a few minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question, stick your hand in the air and we'll bring around a microphone to you. No, they're very shy today.
Mm-hmm.
But on the data
Too early
thing,
in the morning.
yeah. The harmonisation of policy is going to be a tricky one.
Yes.
You talked about it in trade deals, in updating existing trade deals. We're talking process that could go on for years, aren't we?
Well, a long drawn effort in negotiating trade deals is not unique to digital agreements. We've been negotiating with the EU for about 10 years. So, and we hope to conclude soon. Yeah. I think it's not so much how long you take, as much as how substantive the agreement is at the end of the day.
Possibly, but tech is changing fast. The digital economy,
You're right.
Great aspirations, tripling 300
right.
billion. If it's going to take 10 years to get a policy framework to allow cross-border trading flows within key markets, that's going to undermine growth prospects. So
I think that's where we need to have some flexibility in the way we go about this. So it's not just about trying to do a deal at the ASEAN level or at WTO and so on, but having the nimbleness and dexterity to say, can we work on bilateral agreements or agreements with countries that are prepared to move together with you? It has two beneficial effects. The first, of course, it shows how it can be done, and the second, it demonstrates also the value proposition of allowing the data to flow. And I think on both counts, that's why we have embarked on some of these initiatives, such as with Australia and with New Zealand and Chile in different sort of forms. And we're trying to initiate more of such conversations with countries that are prepared to work with us. And the focus is not just on data, by the way. You need to look at things like digital ID and mutual recognition, e-invoicing. Do we have common standards that allow that to interoperate and so on? And if you want to go into some of the newer terrains like artificial intelligence, what are the rules that we want to put in place that govern the use of AI in the context of business so that it remains human-centric and transparent? So I think these are all important conversations. Not every country will be ready to move on all of these issues at the same pace. But what we can do is put it on the table as an agenda item and then see where are the areas we can work together on first, either with partners who are prepared to work on many of these simultaneously or on selective items which are of high priority to industry and to the countries. So I think what I have sensed in the conversations we've had with ministers and government leaders from around the world, there's a clear recognition that this is an important area to be addressed. Not all the answers are apparent, but there's a will to find solutions.
Okay. It's a very big piece of work. Minister, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thanks very much for taking part. Please join me in thanking Minister
Thank you very
Iswaran.
much. Thank you.